There are moments when casual questions about daily habits unexpectedly unlock trauma that has been carefully contained for years. When what appears to be a simple lifestyle choice reveals itself as a psychological survival mechanism. And when the familiar comfort of television entertainment becomes impossible for someone who associates screens with experiences too painful to revisit. Sometimes the things we avoid are not preferences, but necessities. Sometimes the boundaries we construct around our media consumption protect us from triggers we cannot safely encounter. And sometimes a game show host asking why someone does not watch television receives an answer that transforms entertainment into bearing witness to suffering that demands recognition and response. These stories illustrate how combat trauma infiltrates unexpected aspects of daily life, how survivors develop elaborate strategies to avoid stimuli that activate post-traumatic symptoms, and how public disclosure of these private struggles can create opportunities for education, advocacy, and collective acknowledgement of sacrifice that extends far beyond physical injury. Captain Erik Sorensen, United States Air Force retired, appeared on the Family Feud stage during Veterans Week at 42 years old with his wife Maria, their 3 children ranging in age from 8 to 15, and his younger sister who had supported him through the most difficult period of his recovery. Erik presented as physically healthy and professionally composed, giving no immediate indication of the psychological burden he carried or the extensive accommodations he had developed to manage symptoms that persisted 15 years after the events that caused them. Harvey conducted standard pre-game interviews with characteristic warmth, asking Erik about his Air Force career and his current civilian work as an aerospace engineer. The conversation proceeded conventionally through several exchanges about Erik's service as an Air Force pilot, his deployments, and his transition to civilian employment. Steve then pivoted to lighter topics, asking about the Sorensen family's hobbies and how they spent time together. Maria mentioned that they enjoyed outdoor activities, that the children participated in various sports, and that the family valued time spent in nature and physical activity. Steve, maintaining his engaging conversational style, made a comment about families watching television together and asked whether the Sorensen family had favorite shows they enjoyed as a group. Erik's response, delivered with careful control that suggested he had anticipated this question might arise, departed significantly from typical game show banter. He explained that his family did not watch television, that they did not own a television set, and that he had not watched television programming of any kind since 2009. The statement was delivered matter-of-factly, but the specificity of the year and the absolute nature of the prohibition indicated this was not a casual preference or a general concern about screen time for children. Steve, recognizing that Erik's answer suggested a deeper story, asked the natural follow-up question about why the family had made this choice. Erik paused, visibly weighing whether to provide the full explanation or offer a deflecting partial answer that would preserve privacy while satisfying curiosity. The pause extended long enough that everyone in the studio recognized something significant was occurring beneath the surface of what had seemed like a simple question about television habits. When Erik spoke, his decision to provide complete honesty rather than protective evasion was immediately apparent. He stated that he could not watch television because doing so triggered severe post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms related to his service as a drone pilot during multiple deployments to combat zones between 2006 and 2009. The revelation stopped all standard proceedings immediately. Harvey's expression shifted from entertainment host to someone recognizing that the conversation had entered territory requiring careful handling and respectful attention. The studio audience went silent. Erik continued speaking, explaining that his role in the Air Force had involved operating remotely piloted aircraft, commonly known as drones, from ground control stations that utilized multiple video screens to pilot the aircraft, operate weapon systems, and conduct surveillance missions in support of combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The work had required spending 12 to 14 hours daily staring at screens displaying real-time video feeds from aircraft operating thousands of miles away, watching those feeds with intensity necessary to identify targets, assess threats, make rapid decisions about weapons employment, and observe the results of those decisions. Erik described the psychological impact of this work with clinical precision that suggested extensive therapy had helped him develop language for experiences that initially had no adequate vocabulary. He explained that unlike traditional pilots who operated from aircraft cockpits and experienced combat through their own physical presence in the environment, drone operators conducted warfare while physically located in climate-controlled facilities in Nevada or other stateside locations. They would pilot aircraft over Afghanistan or Iraq for a combat mission lasting hours, directly observing and participating in lethal operations, and then drive home to their families in suburban neighborhoods, attempting to transition between these radically different realities within the span of a 30-minute commute. The psychological dissonance of this arrangement, the impossibility of adequately processing what they had witnessed and done during their shifts before returning to normal domestic life, created conditions for developing severe post-traumatic stress disorder that many drone operators experienced but few discussed openly due to concerns about being perceived as weak or unsuitable for continued service. The specific trauma that had made television viewing impossible for Erik involved an incident in 2009 during what should have been a routine surveillance mission. He had been piloting a drone monitoring a compound in Afghanistan that intelligence indicated housed Taliban fighters planning attacks on coalition forces. After hours of observation, personnel emerged from the compound and entered vehicles. Erik had been given authorization to employ weapons against the vehicles based on intelligence assessments and established rules of engagement. He had fired missiles that destroyed the vehicles and killed the occupants. Subsequent review of additional video footage and intelligence gathering had revealed that the intelligence assessment had been incorrect, that the compound had housed civilians, and that the people Erik had killed included women and children who posed no threat and had no connection to Taliban operations. The studio remained completely silent as Erik described the aftermath of this incident. He explained that the military investigation had determined that he had followed proper procedures, that he had acted on the best available intelligence, that the authorization to employ weapons had been appropriate based on what was known at the time, and that he bore no responsibility for the failure of intelligence that had led to civilian casualties. These official determinations had provided no psychological relief. Erik stated plainly that he had killed innocent people, that he had watched them die on video screens, that he had taken mothers and fathers from children and children from parents, and that no procedural correctness could change these facts or alleviate his guilt and grief about what he had done. The connection to television viewing became clear as Erik continued his explanation. He described how after the incident, he had begun experiencing severe flashbacks and intrusive memories whenever he viewed any screen displaying video content. The visual format of television, the act of watching moving images on a screen, had become inextricably associated with the hours he had spent watching video feeds from drone cameras, including the feed that had shown him the results of his weapons employment in 2009. His brain could not distinguish between benign entertainment television and the screens that had mediated his participation in killing civilians. Attempting to watch television, even innocuous programming with no connection to military themes or violence, would trigger acute anxiety, flashbacks to the incident, and psychological distress severe enough to require hours or days to recover from. Erik explained that after several years of attempting to manage these symptoms through various therapeutic interventions, he and his treatment providers had concluded that the most effective strategy was complete avoidance of television and similar video media. His family had removed their television. He avoided environments where television was playing, and he had structured his life and his children's lives around this necessary accommodation. He acknowledged that this created challenges, that his children were sometimes perceived as odd by peers because they could not discuss television shows or streaming content, that explaining the absence of television required either lying or discussing his trauma, and that he sometimes felt guilt about imposing this limitation on his family. However, the alternative of attempting to tolerate television exposure and managing the resulting symptoms had proven unsustainable. Maria, Erik's wife, spoke to provide additional context about their family's adaptation to this requirement. She explained that when she and Erik had married, she had initially not fully understood the severity of his symptoms or the necessity of avoiding television. She had assumed he was being overly rigid or that with time his tolerance would improve. Witnessing him experience a severe flashback episode after accidentally encountering a television playing in a public space had convinced her of the genuine nature of his condition and the importance of maintaining the accommodations he needed. She described how their family had learned to find entertainment and connection through activities that did not involve screens, how they read extensively, engaged in outdoor recreation, played board games and card games, and developed strong communication skills because they spent time talking with each other rather than passively consuming media. The children contributed their perspectives on growing up without television. The eldest, a 15-year-old daughter, explained that while she had sometimes felt excluded from peer conversations about popular shows, she had also developed interests and skills that set her apart in positive ways. She read voraciously, played 3 musical instruments, and had developed a passion for astronomy that had been nurtured by family stargazing activities that might not have occurred if television had been available as easier entertainment. The middle child, a 12-year-old son, acknowledged that explaining to friends why they did not have television was sometimes uncomfortable, but that he had learned to be honest about his father's service and the lasting impact of that service, viewing it as an opportunity to educate peers about the real consequences of war and military service. Steve Harvey stood absolutely still throughout these explanations, his face showing progression from surprise to comprehension to profound sadness. When Erik and his family finished speaking, Steve remained silent for several long moments, visibly struggling to formulate an adequate response. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual energy or humor. He stated that in decades of hosting Family Feud and conducting thousands of interviews, he had never considered that someone might be unable to watch television due to combat trauma, had never understood that drone warfare created psychological burdens distinct from but equally severe as those experienced by personnel in traditional combat roles, and had certainly never imagined that asking about television viewing habits would lead to testimony about killing civilians and the 15-year aftermath of that experience. Steve addressed the cameras and studio audience directly, explaining that the taping could not continue with standard game show proceedings after what Erik had shared. The revelation about why Erik could not watch television had transformed the conversation from entertainment into something requiring different treatment and response. Steve explained that Erik's testimony illustrated several important realities about modern warfare and its impact on service members. The technology that allowed warfare to be conducted remotely, from control stations thousands of miles from the battlefield, created new forms of psychological burden that were not adequately understood or addressed by existing support systems. The personnel who operated these systems were warriors who engaged in combat and made life and death decisions with profound consequences, but they did so in ways that isolated them from traditional forms of military community and subjected them to unique forms of moral injury and psychological distress. Steve emphasized that Erik had followed proper procedures, had acted on authorized intelligence, and had been officially cleared of any wrongdoing in the 2009 incident. These facts did not eliminate his suffering or his sense of responsibility for the deaths he had caused. The official determination that he had done nothing wrong provided no comfort because the core reality remained unchanged. He had killed innocent people, he had watched them die, and he would carry that burden for the rest of his life. The accommodation of avoiding television, the restructuring of his family's life around this necessity, represented his ongoing attempt to manage symptoms and maintain functioning despite psychological wounds that had not healed and might never heal completely. Steve announced that Family Feud would provide full prize compensation to both families regardless of game outcomes, that his foundation would make a significant donation to organizations providing mental health services specifically designed for drone operators and other personnel dealing with moral injury from remote warfare, and that he would use his platform to advocate for better recognition of the psychological challenges facing this population of service members. He emphasized that Erik's willingness to share his story publicly, to explain why something as commonplace as watching television had become impossible for him, represented an act of courage that served important educational and advocacy purposes even as it exposed him to potential judgment or misunderstanding from those unfamiliar with combat trauma. The episode underwent substantial restructuring before airing 6 weeks later. Rather than a standard game show format, The broadcast presented an extended interview with Erik and his family about drone warfare, moral injury, and the long-term process of living with post-traumatic stress disorder. The segment included educational content from mental health professionals, explaining how trauma associated with video-mediated combat could create associations that made television viewing triggering, from military chaplains discussing the particular spiritual and moral challenges faced by personnel who participated in lethal operations from remote locations, and from other drone operators who had experienced similar struggles and had developed various strategies for managing symptoms and rebuilding their lives after service. The response to the broadcast was substantial and multifaceted. Thousands of current and former drone operators contacted the show and related organizations to share their own experiences with post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury, and the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life after serving in roles that few people understood and fewer still acknowledged as legitimate combat service. Many described feeling invisible, their experiences dismissed or minimized because they had not been physically present in combat zones and had not faced direct physical danger in the same ways as traditional combat personnel. Erik's public testimony validated their experiences, provided language for struggles they had difficulty articulating, and created space for broader conversation about the psychological costs of remote warfare. Military mental health professionals and researchers responded by emphasizing that Erik's case illustrated patterns they had been observing and studying for years. Drone operators experienced post-traumatic stress disorder at rates comparable to or exceeding those of personnel in traditional combat roles, but they faced unique barriers to receiving adequate care, including stigma about seeking help for psychological rather than physical injuries, lack of recognition from military culture that their experiences constituted real combat, and insufficient availability of providers trained in treating the specific forms of trauma associated with remote warfare. The technology that allowed precise targeting and reduced risk to American service members created new categories of moral injury when that precision failed, or when intelligence errors led to unintended casualties. The segment also generated discussion about the ethics and psychology of remote warfare more broadly. Scholars and policy experts noted that as military operations increasingly relied on unmanned systems and remote operations, understanding and addressing the psychological impact on operators would become increasingly critical. The assumption that removing personnel from physical danger would reduce psychological burden had proven false. In some ways, the conditions of remote warfare created forms of trauma that were more difficult to process than traditional combat, because they involved extended surveillance of targets, detailed observation of the results of weapons employment, and the cognitive dissonance of participating in lethal operations, while physically located in comfortable, safe environments far removed from any danger. Erik became an advocate for drone operators and for service members dealing with moral injury more broadly. He testified before congressional committees about the need for specialized mental health services, for research into effective treatments for trauma associated with remote warfare, and for better preparation and support for personnel assigned to these roles. He worked with military chaplains and ethics instructors to develop training materials addressing the moral and spiritual challenges of drone operations. He participated in peer support programs connecting former drone operators who were struggling with similar issues to each other, and to resources for managing their symptoms and rebuilding their lives. His relationship with television viewing evolved somewhat over the years following his Family Feud appearance. With continued therapy and gradual exposure work conducted in controlled therapeutic settings, Erik developed increased tolerance for brief exposure to video content in specific contexts. He would never watch television in the conventional sense, would never be able to sit comfortably consuming entertainment media for extended periods, but he gained ability to tolerate incidental exposure when necessary for work or social situations without experiencing debilitating symptoms. This limited progress represented significant therapeutic achievement, while acknowledging that complete recovery from his trauma was neither possible nor necessary for building a meaningful life. The Sorensen family maintained their household practices of not having a television and prioritizing activities that did not involve screen-based media. This remained partially an accommodation for Erik's continuing symptoms, and partially a positive choice they had discovered offered benefits beyond symptom management. The children continued to develop in ways that reflected this upbringing, showing strong interpersonal skills, diverse interests, and capacity for sustained attention that their parents and teachers attributed partly to growing up without the constant availability of passive screen entertainment. 5 years after the Family Feud episode, Erik participated in a documentary examining the experiences of drone operators during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. He provided extensive interview content about his service, the incident that had caused his injury, the 15-year process of learning to live with his trauma, and his ongoing advocacy work. The documentary included footage of Erik visiting the memorial wall at the Air Force headquarters, where names of Air Force personnel killed in action were inscribed, reflecting on how his invisible wounds were equally real and equally consequential as the physical injuries that ended other careers and other lives, even though they did not result in his name appearing on memorial walls or his family receiving the same recognition as families of those killed in action. The documentary showed Erik conducting training sessions with current drone operators, teaching them about moral injury, providing guidance on recognizing symptoms of psychological distress in themselves and their colleagues, and emphasizing the importance of seeking help early rather than allowing symptoms to accumulate and intensify over years of service. He spoke candidly with the operators about the burden of taking human life, about the particular challenges of doing so through video screens from secure locations, about the guilt that could accompany mistakes, and the weight that accompanied even justified uses of force. His message balanced acknowledgement of the difficult realities of their work with emphasis on the importance and legitimacy of their service, on their role as warriors who made genuine sacrifices, even if those sacrifices were primarily psychological rather than physical. The documentary concluded with Erik and Maria discussing their marriage and family life, emphasizing both the challenges and the strengths that had developed in response to Erik's trauma. Maria acknowledged that being married to someone with severe post-traumatic stress disorder required constant adaptation, required developing tolerance for limitations and accommodations, required accepting that recovery was an ongoing process rather than a destination reached at some defined point. She also emphasized that Erik's trauma did not define their marriage or their family, that they had built a rich and meaningful life together that included joy and connection and purpose, alongside the ongoing management of his symptoms. Erik reflected on his decision to share his story on Family Feud and in subsequent advocacy work. He explained that for many years after the 2009 incident, he had believed that silence about his trauma was necessary, that speaking about what he had done and how it affected him would be self-indulgent or would inappropriately burden others with his struggles. Therapy had helped him understand that silence about trauma often perpetuated suffering, that sharing his experience could serve important purposes, including educating others about the realities of military service, reducing stigma around mental health treatment, and connecting with other service members dealing with similar struggles. His appearance on Family Feud, where a simple question about television viewing had opened the door to discussing his trauma publicly for the first time, had been simultaneously terrifying and liberating, forcing him to speak truths he had been protecting, but also validating the significance of his experience and the legitimacy of his ongoing struggles. 10 years after the Family Feud episode, Erik was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy about ethics, moral injury, and the psychological dimensions of modern warfare. He stood before future Air Force officers who would inherit the technologies and responsibilities he had carried, who would face their own decisions about how to employ weapons from remote locations, who would bear their own psychological burdens from their service. He told them about his experience, about the decision to fire missiles based on intelligence he believed to be accurate, about discovering he had killed civilians, about the 15 years of managing trauma that followed. He emphasized that he would make the same tactical decision again in the same circumstances with the same information available. That second-guessing decisions made under operational conditions with imperfect intelligence was neither fair nor productive, but that understanding the potential psychological consequences of such decisions was essential for preparation and for ensuring adequate support systems existed. Erik concluded his academy address with guidance about how to maintain psychological health and moral grounding, when conducting warfare through technological mediation. He emphasized the importance of remembering that video screens showed real people whose deaths had real consequences, that the distance and abstraction created by remote operations could not be allowed to diminish recognition of the gravity of taking human life, and that treating the work with appropriate seriousness and weight was essential for maintaining ethical conduct and for processing the inevitable psychological burden of participating in lethal operations. He encouraged the cadets to develop strong support networks, to utilize mental health resources proactively rather than waiting for crisis, to speak honestly with each other about their experiences and struggles, and to recognize that seeking help represented strength and professional responsibility rather than weakness. The comprehensive impact of Erik's testimony on Family Feud and in subsequent advocacy work demonstrated how personal disclosure of trauma in unexpected contexts could catalyze broader understanding and policy change. His revelation that he could not watch television because of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder, shared in response to a casual question during what was supposed to be lighthearted entertainment, had created space for education about moral injury, about the psychological costs of remote warfare, and about the diversity of ways that military service could create lasting trauma requiring lifelong management. Steve Harvey's response to Erik's testimony, his immediate recognition that the conversation had transcended entertainment and required different handling, his willingness to abandon standard programming format in favor of extended discussion of serious trauma, illustrated how media platforms could serve purposes beyond entertainment when approached with appropriate flexibility and respect. The decision to restructure the episode around Erik's story, rather than attempting to force it into game show format, acknowledged that some testimonies demanded particular forms of witness and response. The subsequent advocacy work, policy developments, and individual healing processes that flowed from Erik's public disclosure demonstrated outcomes that extended far beyond what could have been anticipated when Steve Harvey asked a simple question about family television habits. Recognition that military service in the 21st century involved forms of combat and trauma that differed significantly from previous wars. Acknowledgement that technological mediation of violence created psychological burdens that were no less real than those created by direct physical engagement with combat. And commitment to developing appropriate support systems for personnel conducting remote warfare should inform how military institutions and civilian society understand and respond to this population of service members. Erik Sorensen's inability to watch television, a seemingly simple lifestyle limitation, represented the ongoing impact of moral injury sustained through participation in drone warfare 15 years after the causative incident. His willingness to explain this publicly, to connect his accommodation to the specific events and circumstances that necessitated it, and to use his experience as a platform for advocacy and education, transformed private suffering into opportunity for collective learning, and for systemic improvements in how the military and society support personnel dealing with combat trauma. The recognition that asking someone why they do not watch television might receive an answer involving killed civilians, 15 years of post-traumatic stress disorder, and complete restructuring of family life around necessary accommodations should inform how we approach conversations about service and sacrifice, reminding us that trauma manifests in unexpected ways, and that seemingly mundane aspects of daily life can carry profound significance for those managing invisible wounds from their service.